Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Thank you so much for being with us. Our second session is now going to begin, and our theme for the session is consumption, identity, and race relations. We're going to have Samantha Smith, Kowalewski, and Saarah Rahman. So we're going to begin with Sam.
Hello everyone, so I'm Sam. I'm a third-year honors student. It's pushed me to do a lot of things I typically wouldn't do, such as public speaking, but here I am. And today I'm going to be providing an overview of my thesis that looked into the emotional landscape of working in food security initiative work. So defining food insecurity. Food insecurity is a condition in which people have limited or uncertain access to adequate food to meet their nutritious needs, and this is due to a variety of economic and social factors which determine food access. Food insecurity has been deemed to be a serious population health issue with negative implications on physical and mental health outcomes and increased use of healthcare utilization. So in Canada, food insecurity has a significant presence, with 12.7% of Canadian households being considered food insecure, which made 1.46 million food bank visits across Canada in 2022. Looking specifically at British Columbia, we can see that 11.8%, or about 485,000 British Columbians, fit the criteria of food insecurity. And then the role of food security initiatives are to alleviate food insecurity in their communities. So they're run by a combination of volunteer and paid staff, and this means most of the work goes unpaid or severely underpaid. And it's emotionally taxing work due to the fact that they have a regular exposure to the issue of food insecurity, and they're working to mend the goals that have been produced by current for-profit systems of distribution, So a term coined by Hochschild called emotional labor refers to the management of emotions on behalf of employees to satisfy their job requirements, reflect a positive disposition of their company, and ensure the customer's return investment. So there are two key aspects to emotional labor, the first being the management and elicitation of particular emotions, and the second being to alter a state of mind of the customer, which is the product of successfully managing and eliciting emotions. And because this is a public-facing interaction, it requires face-to-face levels of interaction with a population of people. But Hochschild's theory thus far has really only been applied to paid contexts of labor. And there's a gap in research that has applied this theoretical framework to unpaid positions, such as volunteers. So my research looks to fill this gap in three major ways. So the first guiding question for this was, what does the performance of emotional labor look like for food security initiatives? The second being, how does this performance vary between volunteer and paid positions? And in the interest of time, I won't be going in depth into the types of support needed by these food security initiatives. That's kind of future implications, which I'm happy to discuss after the presentation. Briefly looking at my methods, I first performed a review of literature and developed my theoretical framework. So my review of literature was just looking at statistical works on the issue of food insecurity as a whole and its presence in Canada. And then this really helped to frame my argument. And then I used Hochschild as my focus, guiding my interest in emotions. And then Smith and Schutz helped to guide my methodological choices. The next component of my research was ethnographic observation. So for a period of 4 months, I played the role of a researching volunteer at a local initiative called City Pantry. And this was to highlight lived experience in motion rather than trying to apply theoretical frameworks to the experiences of my participants. And then finally, I performed 3 semi-structured interviews, 2 with paid staff and 2 with a volunteer, to highlight the perceived experiences of the people I was researching and give them a chance to articulate their own experiences. So looking at food insecurity in the context, looking at emotional labor in the context of City Pantry, there was a face-to-face element of this emotional labor.
Oh, my bad. I don't know what happened there.
These are my slides. So So there was a face-to-face element of emotional labor. That's like the classic definition in Hochschild's framework of the theory. But this face-to-face element looked pretty different from what you'd find commonly in the service industry. So the patron state of mind was not produced in order to portray the company in a particular light, which is meant to secure profit. Instead, patrons were intended to feel supported by providing them with a good that they face barriers in accessing. So this would mean that workers at City Pantry didn't have to engage in the customer's always right or putting on a smile kind of performance that you'd see in, say, a coffee shop from a barista. Rather, they actually had more firm and direct interactions with their patrons, which in turn increased efficiency and maximized distribution. And this distribution piece is really what allows for the supported state of mind to come through in patrons. Beyond face-to-face, an additional kind of element of emotional labor that was evident at City Pantry was specific to interacting with systems. So system-to-face interactions really speak to how systems determine the lives of individuals and the operations of City Pantries and like organizations. So staff were faced with regulating their emotions towards their need to work within the confines of the current system to sustain their operations, and also regulating their feelings towards having to witness the effects of the systemic conditions on the people that they're serving on such a regular basis. A third kind of part of this emotional labor thing is also specific to the system interaction, but it can be flipped to reflect the collaborative efforts of City Pantry in both trying to address food insecurity and impose change onto the current structures of food distribution. So we can see at the beginning of this visual that structural conditions are shaped by resources in the material world. So laws, policies, and practices surrounding food distribution are shaped from the availability of these food resources, which are then imposed onto individuals. Then individual understandings of these structures lead to the formation of collectives such as City Pantry, which then work to impose changes onto the structures. So at the end where the light bulb is there, you can see that City Pantry hopes to highlight food insecurity and food waste so that decision makers in the structural element can reflect and change their mind in regards to how we are currently distributing food based on the material availability in the world. Excuse me. So this is kind of a different kind of emotional labor because they're trying to actually alter the state of mind in decision makers at a structural level. Finally, looking at the parallels between the enaction of emotional labor in volunteer versus paid staff roles, there's a decrease in sense of firm interactions with patrons on a volunteer level, just because they appear to be more conditioned to what's expected in these interactions from the customer service culture, those kind of more gentle interactions. Except this was different for those volunteers that were more long-term and regular, as they were more integrated into the space and realized that need to maximize efficiency in food distribution. And of course, paid staff had increased instances of these firm interactions, as they're also very integrated and understand the interest of efficiency maximization. And then next, volunteers also engaged in face-to-system emotional labor just by nature of working at City Pantry. But they weren't always aware, whereas by nature of paid staff roles and their knowledge and long-term exposure to the issue meant that they were more aware of the structural impositions that they were putting forward. But this also came with an increased risk of mental health implications. So in summary, volunteers at City Pantry align with Hochschild's definition of emotional labor in two major ways. The first being that well-integrated volunteers were effective in managing and eliciting their emotions to interact firmly with patrons. The second being that all volunteers play a role in the effective provision of food and pushing for structural change, which is working to alter state of minds on both a consumer and structural level. And then with regard to paid staff, although they are paid, this is not the primary driving force of their work. With every paid staff member that I spoke to, they were more interested in their desire to offer support to their community and see those structural changes. So with these findings in mind, it suggests that emotional labor can exist beyond just wage labor. The theory can actually be expanded to encompass wageless labor or instances in which labor was not driven by pay. And a quick thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, hello, my name is Kowalewski, and today I'm presenting on my undergraduate thesis research titled Reclaiming the Rainbow, Queer Identity Formation in Response to Rainbow Marketing. My goal with this project was to center the queer perspective in the study of rainbow marketing, more commonly known as rainbow capitalism. Thank you. So for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to briefly look at what rainbow marketing is. At a theoretical model I developed from the existing literature, glance at my methodology, and then for the rest of the time look at my findings and look at how a study of rainbow marketing quickly turned into the study of reclamation. So to start, I want to define rainbow marketing and why I chose to use this term over the more common rainbow capitalism. So rainbow marketing I've defined as advertising which co-opts queer imagery, vernacular, and identity for the sake of selling products. And this old Bud Light ad, I think, is a good example of all three of those elements. You see the co-opting of imagery with the use of the rainbow, the co-opting of vernacular with use of the word queens. What are they doing wrong?
Oh no, we're laughing at that.
Oh, okay. The co-opting of identity itself, which is shown in the LGBTQ acronym itself, each of those letters standing for an identity category, so lesbian, gay, and so on. Being used to sell products itself is obviously a co-opting of the identity. And I chose to use the term rainbow marketing because rainbow capitalism, even though it's more common, is very expansive. It captures the place of queerness in a broader capitalist system. However, rainbow marketing, I really wanted to focus in on how queer folks relate to these advertisements themselves. So how when queer folks encounter something like this, they are relating to it. This takes me to the model I developed from the literature. The literature about this topic is pretty disjointed. A lot of it actually isn't in the field of sociology. A lot of it is in the field of marketing, so how to do rainbow marketing. And a lot of it is historical as well. So this is a synthesis of the literature across a couple decades. So it starts with the creation of queerness as a social category. This is an understanding of queerness that we take for granted a lot in the modern day. We think it has always been a facet of identity, but in fact in the past it was viewed as a behavior. So it's something that you did, having sexual romantic relationships with a person of the same sex, not who you were. Once it becomes a facet of identity, we see a queer community form. This is well charted in the literature. From there, that community is taken advantage of through the creation of the queer market block. That's the distilling of the community to those people who are deemed profitable by marketing executives. So who is being marketed to? That marketing takes the form of rainbow marketing. To briefly go past that era real quick, we see individual queer identity. The conglomerate of that is simply a queer community. What I was really focused on was this relationship in the bottom here between rainbow marketing and individual queer identity. Because as I've shown, the literature shows that if there is a connection between rainbow marketing and individual queer identity, if rainbow marketing genuinely shapes how we view our own identities, it closes the cycle, and this is a very insidious process. We get trapped into this cycle of rainbow marketing in which folks outside of the community are shaping who we are as a community. That takes me to my methodology. I conducted semi-structured interviews with 3 members of the local queer community, and by a combination of happenstance and my own positionality within the community, all of these people were of a very similar demographic. So they were all AFAB or assigned female at birth, so they don't all identify as women. They all use the word queer to describe their identities. They are all in some meaningful way politically or socially engaged in social justice activism, and they're all UBC students in the arts department. So the sampling procedure, because it was such a small demographic, I reached saturation very quickly. There was a large amount of consistency in how these people were approaching rainbow marketing, which takes me to my findings. I'm going to look at the idea of an eclectic identity, a history of reclamation, which is the similarity, and reclaiming the rainbow. So as I was studying this, I was looking at the concept of queer identity formation to understand if rainbow marketing is a factor in queer identity formation. And to get slightly ahead of myself, I found that it wasn't. So instead, what I ended up finding, what is this main factor of queer identity formation? And what I ended up finding is what I've taken describing as the eclectic queer identity. And this is the idea that essentially we think of queerness as part of an implicit binary in queerness and cis heterosexuality exist in this binary. You must be one or the other. So queerness comes to be defined simply as the absence of cis heterosexuality, but what that absence is filled with is up to individual interpretation. Queer identity is fundamentally expansive. It is almost the absence of a label as much as it is a label. And some of my participants explicitly reference this when they're talking about the idea of signaling or recognizing someone on the street as queer. They said finding these kind of contradictory elements, these weird overlaps, these frayed edges of different parts of identity is how they recognize queerness in other people. We could argue that though this wasn't something that my participants looked at explicitly, that this is a response to the ideas of Judith Butler. She argued that identity labels, such as the term lesbian, are still tools of an oppressive regime because they have strict boundaries. Even if I were to define as lesbian, I'm still feeding into those ideas that there are clear boundaries to this identity. The queer identity is eclectic. It doesn't fall into this pattern. One of those pieces of an eclectic queer identity, one of those scraps of identity, is this idea of reclamation. This isn't universal, but it's something that all of my participants spoke to quite frequently. So reclamation, I have defined as the co-opting of marginalizing terms, events, and ideas, and turning them into a fundamental facet of identity. So as the word suggests, it's the taking back of marginalizing forces. The word queer itself is the most prominent example of this. It was a slur, which then became a tool of explaining identity. And when my participants were talking about reclamation, one talked about it in reference to this brand of shoe called Doc Martens that I've shown on the screen here. And this is a common theme in signaling for AFAB people. Wearing these shoes is a way of showing to others that you're part of the queer community, which is a valuable thing to do, especially because none of my participants grew up in Vancouver originally. When they moved here, they would purchase these shoes in order to mark their place within the community so other queer folks would find them and they could have this connection. And my participant said about these shoes, people are willing to go through the pain of breaking in these shoes to have them mold exactly to who they are, to the true shape of them. They signaled a connection between the difficult process of breaking in shoes with the difficult process of breaking in their identity. And instead of making rainbow marketing shape their identity, they force rainbow marketing to shape who they are. So I looked at quite a few ways that they engaged in reclamation, both active and passive. As I said, eclectic identity is one of these ways because eclectic identity is expansive, while rainbow marketing, as we saw in that first slide, it's reductive. We see also simple avoidance, choosing not to purchase products which are part of rainbow marketing. So even though a lot of people think Doc Martens are valuable for signaling their identity, they may not buy them from the brand themselves. They may go through mediating bodies such as thrift stores. In one of my interviews, I joked to my participants that the queerest object of clothing that I own is my thrifted Doc Martens, and they immediately were like, yes, that's absolutely it. I would think the same thing. It's very accepted in the community that thrifting is a way of expressing queer identity and not playing into rainbow marketing. Avoidance can also take the form of shopping from brands that have rainbow lines, but instead shopping from the men's section. So engaging with these major brands in ways they were not meant to be engaged with. Another strategy that I really appreciated seeing was the use of humor to change kind of the narrative of rainbow marketing. When I'd ask my participants to give me an example of rainbow marketing that they encountered, a lot of them would start by saying, oh, I have a funny story for you, and they'd be laughing as they told the story. This was especially prominent when one of my participants was talking about she was on an airline and saw an airline safety video that she deemed to be rainbow marketing. And it's noteworthy that she was in this position where she was trapped. This video is in front of her, there is no avoiding it. And instead of letting that kind of bog her down and kind of be a mockery of her identity, she turns it around and starts making fun of the airline, to me, reinstilling the power of queer folks in that situation. So that takes me back to my original literature and that research question of whether rainbow marketing shapes individual queer identity. And what I found is that at least in the small demographic community, this isn't the case because of the conscious and active work of reclamation that's being done. And even though I only was able to study a very small segment of the queer community, the fact that it is even possible to break this cycle is very significant and is very encouraging, because the problem with this cycle is that it is insidious, that it's something that we can't escape. So even if we see only a few people, a small demographic, engaging with work that dismantles this system, that is significant. And it was very encouraging to me to see my own community doing that work. Thank you for your time.
The nature of the positions that are paid, or like the time that the people have spent there, or like the training involved for becoming a paid worker, like that would be for that?
For sure. So volunteer turnovers tend to be pretty high just because there's no real financial incentive to hold their positions there. So volunteers are a lot more likely to have other obligations come up that need priority over like their volunteer unpaid positions. So that means that just by nature of their role, they're spending less time becoming integrated into like city pantry or like organizations. In terms of paid positions, it's the opposite. So they're secure there. Their wage kind of frees them from other instances of wage labor or what have you. So it's more of a priority, and they have like long-term exposure and integration into the space. So that kind of navigates those interactions because they're more aware of the need to prioritize the maximization of food distribution, whereas volunteers are kind of more in and out, I guess you could say.
I have a question for Al. I really like the way you identified the gap in your research, but I'm a little bit skeptical about how class affects that reclamation. Because I can totally see like upper middle class and like higher, like or like upper class queer folks like being super targeted by these things.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a big topic within my thesis itself. My original intention was actually to speak to people who lived on Davie, because that is kind of people who fit more typically into that queer market block. So the queer market block is usually describing affluent white gay men with dual male incomes and no dependents, because that's a really profitable segment of the population to target. And so a lot of those ads traditionally have targeted those demographics, and it's just based on kind of just my sampling and how the project ended up working out that I wasn't able to work with those communities. But that's something I would really, really like to study in the future, is kind of expanding that out and looking at how people in different age demographics and especially in different classes are targeted and how they relate to it. Because there are also people within the queer community who are making rainbow marketing. So I'd love to know why they're engaging in that practice and kind of how that factors into their identity as well.
I have a question for Hal, actually. Do you think, I don't know if this is something you looked at in your research, but I'd be interested to know more about how this sort of like rainbow marketing relates to like more furtive aspects of it. Like, for example, like something like TV shows, where they try to present this, you know, and maybe it's like written by queer people too, but they try to present this idea of being queer, right? And the ways they like use dress, costumes, mannerisms, how they like try to market that idea and like try to work it into sort of like a mainstream framework. I don't know if you've looked at that or if that's something.
I have, yeah. So when they're trying to appeal to the queer market block, there are actually two different strategies. There's rainbow marketing, so which are the things like what I showed in the advertisement that are very painfully obvious. And then there's also something called gay window advertising, which was much more common in about the 1980s. And essentially it is making advertisements that queer people will pick up are queer coded and straight folks typically will not. So kind of in the 1980s, when we were seeing advertisements in storefronts and things like that, that was happening a lot. And it would be kind of in the way people were dressed, or maybe in the way they were posed in the photos. And then now in the modern day, something I talked about in my thesis is we see this a lot with targeted advertisements. So there can be ads that are visibly queer or explicitly queer, but they're only being shown to queer folks themselves on social media and things like that. So I've called it kind of the modern gay window advertising, and that it's achieving the same thing, even though the ad doesn't quite look the same. It's only going to queer folks, and then the brands don't have to kind of put themselves out there and potentially lose straight consumers.
Yeah, I have another question for Hal, but it's inspired by what I know about Sam's research, so if you could comment on that too. But Sam makes a lot of the humor aspect too, and I'm wondering what you think the critical component of, because sometimes humor can just be a conformist or a cathartic response, but you're saying it's actually a critical response. I'm wondering if it might actually be a way of acknowledging these bigger structures, like the capitalism aspect, the bigger picture, when they're speaking back and mocking the market
Yeah, absolutely. I think the humor aspect is all about agency, and it's about reinstilling agency. And I think it's not just my participants who do this. I didn't have the concrete data to support it, but in my own experience, the idea of making fun of rainbow marketing is very common in the queer community. It's kind of a joke that people will fall back on, and this is something that people are very consciously engaging with because it's a way of shifting the agency of you are trying to make a mockery of us by thinking that putting a rainbow on something, like that we're silly enough to just buy it because there's a rainbow on it. So shifting that agency and saying that even though we do have to fall into this capitalist system, and sometimes we do have to buy these products, we are not taking it for what you're giving to us. We're instead making you the person who's silly in this situation rather than our identities.
Yeah, agency was, I would second that for my research as well. I mean, when it comes to responding to structural conditions, like structures can make all kinds of people feel all kinds of ways. So I think a lot of the time, like, humor was used as a way of like offloading a lot of stress at city pantries. So an instance that really comes to mind for me was like patrons started getting kind of agitated and upset by how long they were having to wait in the line. And then the translator kind of just took a step back and said, okay, boss lady, we'll get to you like with everyone else. And everyone laughed, including the upset patron who then, ended up having really positive experiences with the staff. So it's a way of like reclaiming agency in the sense that they're not letting like the systemic conditions take control. They're not letting it throw them off of their intended outcome. They're actually using humor to like offload that kind of, intense stimuli or like distressing stimuli and recenter themselves in their ultimate goal of addressing the issue. So.
This is a question for both of you guys. Where do you see future research going with your respective theses?
I am really interested in the implications on the idea of categorization as a whole. Like, I think there's kind of a natural study here that could be done with just other segments of the queer community. I think really expanding that research out and kind of doing the same project with other segments of the community could be valuable. But I also think there's something really interesting to be said here about the effort of categorizing identity as a whole, because I think the label of queer, as this kind of how I've described it, as this anti-label, and it's one of the only labels I can really think of off the top of my head where taking on this label is expansive rather than reducing you to kind of the requirements of that label. And I think looking at the practice of categorizing identity as a whole through that lens and maybe looking at neurodivergent communities and things like that and kind of bringing in different identities could be an interesting launching off point that I'd like to pursue in the future.
As for myself, I feel as though, like, with reference to that visual I provided, I've only really honed in on one real aspect of food distribution and that like chain of interaction. So for myself, I think it would be really useful to move up the chain and kind of maybe interrogate like structural conditions or policymakers or governments and like understand how it is that they come to the decisions that they do. I think also a really important aspect to food security and food waste is what's happening on a production level. So interrogating agricultural industries and farming, I think that would be a really important launching off point to kind of get a holistic understanding of food insecurity as a whole in order to actually craft like meaningful, realistic implications for the future. So.
Thank you everyone for your questions. Thank you so much to these presenters. We've resolved our tech issues, so we're gonna have Saarah present before we go to lunch.
Hi everyone, sorry for being a bit problematic. Moving on to some of the research I did. My research is titled Go Back to Ramadan. And the reason for this is my research mainly focuses on, you can't see that, sorry, but my research focuses on how social media does amplify hate crimes towards Muslims. And I got my inspiration for my research title from this YouTube video where a Muslim man read a Islamophobic tweet that told him to go back to Ramadan. So that was my main inspo for my research. So the outline for my research for presentation is that I'll be discussing my research findings. One of my favorite authors in the entire world, he's a G, Edward Said. some statistics, news articles, again, more academic journals and ideas for research. But again, my main central idea for my research is how does the media amplify hate crimes towards Muslims, especially within white society? Edward Said. So he, in his book Orientalism, again, an amazing book, he speaks about the different stereotypes that Arabs are portrayed within the Western world. We have the belly dancer who is fetishized, especially, and they seem to not be really practicing Muslims. And I can see this in TikTok trends, cultural appropriation, and this is something to think about in the future and something I will be discussing right at the end. And then my research actually focuses on these two topics right here, Muslim women being oppressed, Islam is misogynistic, the savior complex that we need to save Muslim women from Islam, and the extremist label where men and women are extremists, they're brainwashed, and it's going to really relate to some of the examples I mentioned in my research.
Oh, you know,
Oh, no.
I can get it on the mind.
Great. So I've also researched on statistics with wider society. For example, in the UK, 61% of Muslim participants do not want to report workplace discrimination because they're scared to be further discriminated against. And in Canada, hate crime has actually increased across the whole country by 71%. Within my research, I decided to do a cross-comparative study because I'm a British international student studying in Canada, and I thought it would be really cool to make these parallels and correlations between the two countries. Oh, now we're back to the episode. Okay, so question for you guys is, what major event do you think changed the way Muslims are perceived? Anyone want to take a guess? 9/11, yes. We're back, okay. So 9/11 was the turning point for how Muslims were perceived within white society, and throughout all the academic journals I read for my essay, they always mentioned 9/11. And this is where I really got the idea that, hey, identity, especially when it comes towards Muslims, was really socially constructed by the events we live in. These are some news articles I got from the Daily Mail, which is a very prominent British newspaper, and it really shows the stereotypes that are labelled onto Muslims ever since 9/11. And again, some of the pieces of information I got from academic articles, and I really like this one, that constructing meanings and interpretations of what counts as a social problem helps to define a person. So then I divide my research into the political and the social. Politically, Muslims are affected, especially when it comes to social movements. I know in Canada you have the Proud Boys, in the UK unfortunately we have the EDL. And the media does help to amplify these stereotypes that Muslims have within wider society, which these social movements do use for themselves. And socially, Muslims are they are victims of social institutions because of these stereotypes. For example, the criminal justice system. And two very prominent examples I could think about is Omar Kadir and Shamima Begum, both faced injustices from the criminal justice system. In fact, Shamima Begum was even trafficked by a Canadian spy who was working for ISIS, I believe. And she never got the justice she deserved, in my opinion. And she also had her human rights being infringed by the British criminal justice system. And Omar Kadir also faced similar circumstances when he was also deported to Guantanamo Bay. So yeah, we're going to watch just a very short video on, just click the link there.
Oh, yes, okay, so I will have to.
Yeah, just an example of one of the social movements that my country unfortunately has.
I'm going to need to reset the screen share, and just give me 2 seconds.
Basically, you need to get more.
That is the correct video, yes?
Yes.
Okay, good. Please just take 1 second. Okay, good. Should be able to see that. And... No, no, no. No! That didn't go as intended. Well, we know what the algorithm thinks I like. Alright, Shia still working for people at home?
Basically, they need to get water.
Okay, that's mad. Okay, so wait, off our streets.
Yeah.
So
They're our streets.
and then they're taking our dogs.
Yeah. They're taking our raisins, they're taking the lot.
And they took your teeth as well.
Yeah, they did. Basically, they need to get water.
Okay,
Alright,
that's
good.
mad. Okay, so wait.
There we go. Sorry about that. Alright, and. Okay, oh, and we gotta get the, okay, here we go. There you go.
Yeah, so I'm gonna go back to Edward Said because again, he is the main academic I use throughout my essay, and I do use his theories of the othering, imperialism, and hegemony, how the West see the East, especially countries right here, as inferior to them. And this often justifies like imperialism, colonialism, and their intervention. And the fact that Western ideals are a lot more better and again, a lot more, how do I say it? They're a lot more important to whatever values or cultures that everyone else in the world has. And we can clearly see that in social media, in my opinion, right? The way Western narratives do kind of put out narratives of Muslims, especially with some of the newspaper articles you just read. There is no context behind anything from what I've read in the news behind these news articles, because the first thing you see are these really big, massive like titles on the newspaper. For example, we just saw one of Sharia law, but does anyone actually know what Sharia law is? So yeah, the West do actually villainize people who aren't Western, in my opinion. And I think Edward Said really does talk about that like really well in his book. That is like applied to my research. So what my research has kind of made me think about is that identity really is constructed. I thought identity was something that is fixed, but after doing this research, I realized that us individuals can construct the identity of others through the events that we basically live in, and these events are then relayed to us through social media. And for further research, I would love to do qualitative research or interviews on both British and Canadian Muslims, which I am sort of doing this year with British Muslims, but I'd love to extend that further to Muslims who identify as Canadian. I also would have loved to go into social media, TikTok, Instagram a lot more, because I do feel like they would work really well with Edward Said's stereotype on Arab women being stereotyped as belly dancers. Considering TikTok trends, and I would say that you can see a lot of fetishization of Arab women in social media. And again, Canada and the UK have different governances, but they're also socially very similar. So it would also be great to do a cross comparison between maybe two countries that are socially very different. So yeah, thank you for watching, and Ramadan Mubarak.
Much. So we're just going to make sure that everyone has a chance to ask Saarah their questions. So we'll just have a short 5-minute question period.
Hi, great job. And I'm just wondering, has your research kind of pointed to any measures that are effective in kind of rewriting the public narrative or perception of Muslim people? Or have you like seen any instances of Muslim people reclaiming agency of their identity?
Yeah, 100%. Like this, like a reason why I want to go into social media and TikTok is yes, there is Muslims being fetishized 100%. But again, you guys speak about humor. I use humor in my PowerPoint to reclaim agency because I identify as a Muslim. I'm not Arab, but I am Muslim. And you can see a lot of that on TikTok trends as well. There is some controversy though within the Muslim community about Muslims using humor to reclaim agency. But in my opinion, at times it does work because it allows people to have these conversations. It allows people that, hey, it's okay to talk about this, but obviously in a respectful environment. And I do think humor is one way that we do reclaim agency, especially on social media. And I am seeing a lot more Muslim social media influencers also reclaiming their agency by using their platform to raise awareness. And I've been seeing that a lot on my algorithms, my own and my friends. And I think it's really, really nice that we are seeing more representation, and I'm not going to deny that there is more representation of Muslims. Yes, there still needs to be more done when it comes to newspapers and articles and journalism, but I think on social media, I think there is now a really good positive start on Muslims reclaiming back their identity, essentially.
I'm curious to know, because you were mentioning potential next steps, and I'm just wondering, in a future project, what other theorists or thinkers do you think you might draw from when doing this research?
I've actually looked into Nawal al-Zadawi. She's an Egyptian feminist. I've read some of her stuff, and I think it would be really cool to draw her in. I believe she's an Egyptian feminist. Again, I need to read more of her stuff to then finalize, but she is someone that I am considering bringing into like further research in the future.
Yeah, I would just love to better understand your methodology.
Yeah, my methodology was using secondary resources because within this research, because I was doing research on stuff from social media. So I think where I would be drawn to first was newspaper articles and how the news shows Muslims. I didn't really have the funding or the capacity at that point to do qualitative research, but that's why I went to secondary resources, because it was the most accessible and it was also the most it was the most affordable, and it was also really easy to use in my research. But again, it would be really great to have done qualitative, like primary research on how Muslims are affected by these stereotypes, but actually like verbally talking to them, not from my own experiences, but learning from Muslims of other backgrounds as well.
Hi again. I'm also wondering, in your review of literature, did you find anything about how these negative stereotypes and narratives of Muslim people have like personal implications, or how they might affect individuals who are experiencing them?
I can say from my personal experience that I feel like all Muslims tend to be homogenized to being Arab. For example, a lot of people think I'm Arab because I'm Muslim, but I'm South Asian, and I'm proud to be South Asian too. And that's just one reason, that's just one example of a negative implication. There's nothing wrong with being Arab whatsoever, but like it's the fact that we're all homogenized and being from one place when actually there's so many other Muslims, and even when I know a few Muslims who reverted, or some Muslims who are white and they were just born into being Muslim, but no one thinks they're Muslim, and people are like, wait, are you actually Muslim? So now the ideas of being Muslim is now labeled to race, when really anyone can be Muslim regardless of what we look like, but the media has now portrayed all Muslims to be Arab.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Saarah. So we're going to take a break for lunch now, so we'll resume at 12:40.
I'm Catherine Corrigal-Brown, the head of sociology at UBC. Thanks for watching our video. To learn more about UBC sociology, please subscribe.